Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We are ditching our usual format today. No good, bad, and crazy martinis, although I guess in some way it's three good martinis, because it's our annual Things We Are Politically Thankful For episode. As we all get ready to celebrate Thanksgiving on Thursday, it's important to look back at pretty much the last full year and think of the things that we ought to be politically thankful for as conservatives. And Jim, what do you got first?
Well, I should preface this, Greg, by saying that I'm thankful for family and friends and colleagues and the hard work that you do, and of course all of our listeners and the troops and the veterans, all that good stuff. But let's face it, our listeners come here for the funny stuff, not for the heartwarming and touching stuff. So I'm going to focus entirely on the realm of politics, lest anyone think, can you believe they were talking about what they were thankful for and all they talked about was politics? No. So, yes, Greg and I actually do care about the really important stuff. But aside from that, you know what I'm thankful for, Greg?
What?
Those so-called moderate squishes like Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins, who ended up becoming really, really important and handy earlier this year in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation fight. Lindsey Graham, who just got in touch with his inner wildebeest. I don't know whether he was exposed to gamma rays and turned into the Incredible Hulk, or he's kind of the Wolfman, and it was a full moon or something like that. But Lindsey Graham came out fighting with a tenacity that I think a lot of conservatives had wanted to see from the moment it became clear that Brett Kavanaugh was going to be, I'd argue, the victim of a smear. That as much as we sympathize with Christine Blasey Ford, who certainly seemed to have been through something terrible and traumatic, could not generate any supporting witnesses to any portion of her accusation. And I think that there had been if any of those witnesses had said, yeah, I remember something like that happening, I think the entire confirmation fight would have turned out very differently. But Republicans and a lot of conservatives and even a bunch of independents, moderates kind of looked at that and saw, that basically the argument of Democrats was he should be held accountable and punished because of the accusation, not because of there was no due process, there was no supporting evidence, no witnesses, things like that. First of all, Lindsey Graham played an important role in the hearing, and then it really came down to Susan Collins' vote, and she did not merely just happen to vote the right way. I mean, Greg, I don't know about you. If we need that, we can always turn to Joe Manchin. But Susan Collins demonstrated in a speech that I remember I mocked at the time for being a little long, and I kind of regret that mocking. That Susan Collins did an old-fashioned stand up, and she made the argument that she weighed all the evidence, she walked through it, she walked through her decision making, she talked about what had been checked out and what had not, and why she was to this. She denounced the folks who had been demagoguing the issue, and I thought, Susan, there's a certain look. I write for a conservative magazine. I'm a pretty darn right of center guy, and there are plenty of times there have been moderates or folks in the middle. I've thrown my hands up and said I'm fed up with you when I decided you really aren't going to do anything useful when the going gets tough. Arlen Specter comes to mind. Charlie Crist comes to mind. I noticed, Greg, that the ones I really can't stand have this odd habit of eventually flipping parties. Mike Bloomberg, you could put on that list. Lincoln Chafee, who apparently is running for president as a Democrat again. I guess I could be thankful for him too, because he's a bad candidate by any metric, Greg. But the point being with Collins and Graham, moderate Republicans exist for a reason. You're not going to get everything you want in life if you're a conservative Republican, but you're going to have times where you're right. And the stakes are high and the stakes are important. You need to persuade people, okay, this isn't just the usual right-wingers, shouting about stuff like that. And Collins and Graham rose to the occasion, and they made the argument and ended up being probably one of the most consequential victories for conservatives in quite some time. So, let's this Thanksgiving, let's be a little thankful for the folks who don't always pound the table and show up on Fox News and fire up the crowd or something like that every day of the week. But, they have it when it counts, and they demonstrate it, and they make an argument to people who might not be persuaded by the fire breathers and stuff like that. So Graham, Collins, senators, thank you very much.
It's interesting, given where we were in that confirmation process. If the Republicans had just let the Arizona prosecutor continue to question Brett Kavanaugh, I'm not sure it turns out the same way. So Lindsey Graham broke format there, lit up the Democrats, rightfully so, on a number of different points, and I think that really changed things. And obviously Susan Collins with the detailed summary was very powerful as well. And then Joe Manchin just pops on at the end to save his own Senate seat with
Joe Manchin, always there when you don't need him.
Yes, I think that's what Mike Pence actually said. So obviously all of that's under the umbrella of we're thankful that Brett Kavanaugh's the newest justice of the United States Supreme Court. But even before Brett Kavanaugh got nominated, the final spate of decisions from the Supreme Court of the Anthony Kennedy era, and with Neil Gorsuch on the court for his first full term, came down with some really important decisions on a number of different issues that ought to matter a lot to conservatives. And I'm going to mention three, although there are obviously a lot more than that. First of all, the union dues for non-union public sector employees. They don't have to pay those anymore if they don't want to. If they want to, they can. That's up to them. But for folks who aren't members of the unions but had been forced to pay dues before, they don't need to contribute those, which means their money can't be used for political causes that they disagree with. That's an issue that came back to the court and back to the court and back to the court, and finally it got reversed in a way that I think conservatives would agree is far more constitutional. There was also a critical free speech case out in California where the state out there had forced pro-life crisis pregnancy centers to essentially explain to people where and how they could get an abortion. And that was considered a violation of free speech. And then, of course, although I think this is going to be fought another day because it was a limited ruling, the Masterpiece Cake Shop, a right of conscience for Jack Phillips out there in the Colorado Baker case. So we'll see what else the court has in store for us. I would guess that we'll be pretty happy with most decisions coming forward, with Kavanaugh now replacing Kennedy, probably a more reliable constitutional vote. But, Jim, all in all, we usually get a mixed bag at best from the court in June. This year it was almost a clean sweep.
It was, but it's really kind of interesting. All the talk of Anthony Kennedy being the swing vote, since the gay marriage case, I don't think he's been the swing vote against the viewpoint of most folks on the right. I know this cycle, all the 5-4 decisions were kind of with the quote-unquote conservative majority, whether you want to call them originalist or strict constructionist or any other term you prefer. So actually, you may not see an earth-shattering change on this. We may have gotten a preview of the future court this past cycle, and you're right, it was pretty darn good. Should I move on to my second thing? I'm really thankful for, Greg?
Absolutely.
All right. So I am thankful that Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, and I guess very soon to be the senator from Florida, ran this year. Because considering the closeness of the race, the average Republican probably does not beat Bill Nelson in this environment this year. And I came up to the conclusion, first of all, I think you could make an argument that Rick Scott might be one of the single most underrated governors in the country. Not much of a superstar. I've moderated a panel with him, met him a few times. I hope he's not offended if I say he is not a whirling dervish of raw political charisma. And you don't see him, on the national shows all that often unless there's a hurricane. First of all, one of the reasons people like Rick Scott as governor is that in every single hurricane that has hit Florida during the past 8 years he's been governor, the state of Florida has mobilized early, it mobilized quick, and there really have been, by comparisons to other hurricanes, no major screw-ups, and generally the state has moved and mobilized, particularly the one that was hitting the Panhandle earlier this year. And I remember there was a great deal of concern about whether that was going to affect the vote. As far as I could tell, not a single Panhandle county had any real problems with voting on a massive scale. Certainly nothing like Broward, which was not hit by a hurricane. Or you could argue they were hit by a hurricane of incompetence called Snipes. But again, Rick Scott, the time you hear him talk about his state, it's not only that he loves his state, he loves the unique advantages his state has. And for all the, occasional challenges of living there, like the hurricanes and or the occasional Florida man attack, where you shoplift a pair of live crabs in your pants and try to run away in a golf cart or something like that. Florida has the advantage of being obviously the winter home of many residents. Many people have dual residencies. As a result of that, they do tax people who have their summer homes down there, but it means they don't tax their residents very much. They still don't have state income tax, and it's generally a place where people enjoy, spending their golden years. God's waiting room, as I once said in front of Governor Scott, and I could see he didn't quite flinch, but he did not relish me calling the center part of his state God's waiting room. He's a good governor. And the other thing is, I understand, he did much better amongst Democrats and minorities than they traditionally do in that state among Republicans. He's just a very competent guy. And I think we've established, Greg, that, looking at his gubernatorial victory in 2010, his gubernatorial reelection in 2014, and his very narrow Senate election in 2018. Each one of these races he won by about 1% or even less this year. He's in a 6-year term as senator, Greg, but my suspicion is that in 2022, 4 years from now, aliens will invade Florida. And everyone will think humanity is going to get doomed and that they're coming down their giant. And who's going to lead us to an unexpected victory? Rick Scott by 1%, because that's what he does every 4 years, Greg.
Oh, that is a bold prediction. I look forward to that one in the year-end predictions. Jim, applaud that choice. Rick Scott with a big win there. We had looked at the polls very closely in that race all the way up to Election Day. It didn't look great. Every once in a while, he'd be up by a point or two, but Bill Nelson at different times was up 5 or 6 points, and it appeared Republicans were going to lose that race and the governor's race there. So I definitely tip my hat to the Republicans for adding to their majority in a year that, even though the map was in their favor, it still wasn't the greatest of circumstances. And so they're going to have at least +1 in the Senate, +2 if Republicans can hang on in Mississippi next week in the runoff. And that's great news, because we can be thankful that it should make life easier for the Republicans and for President Trump in confirming judges. 84 judges were confirmed so far in this Congress. Hopefully we'll get a few more in the lame duck here. But there's still 158 vacancies to go. And if the Democrats had gotten the majority, that number wouldn't have moved much except up with future retirements and so forth. So a big chance here for the Republican Senate and President Trump to make a stamp on that. So that's good. Excellent choice there on Rick Scott. I'm going to give the president credit for another thing here that I'm thankful for, because president after president, oh gosh, I don't even know how far going back, said, you know what, when I'm elected, we're moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. And then nobody ever did. It was just lip service. I remember Clinton especially doing it, George W. Bush, Obama less so, but he made some references to that as well. Trump said he was going to do it. Everybody just kind of said, yeah, sure, okay. But he did it. It's in Jerusalem now. We're recognizing Jerusalem officially as the capital of Israel. A few other nations are following suit, and it sends a great message to the UN, which obviously has a great deal of hostility towards Israel. And it just sends a good message that when we say we're going to do something, we end up doing it. And so good for Trump for following through on that. We'll see how much of a difference it makes in the long term in terms of our relationship with the Israelis or even our influence in the region. He said he would do it. He did it. Good job.
The final choice for my thanks, Greg, I'm going to be thankful for what whining Democratic sore losers call the gerrymandering of the Senate, or perhaps more accurately, the state lines being drawn the way they are. And it's kind of fascinating to see how much, as soon as it became clear that Republicans were going to keep the Senate and actually add a seat or two, that Democrats started complaining about how unfair this was, how terrible, and you did hear some folks like Joy Behar arguing that the Republican majority in the Senate was only because of gerrymandering. Now, we have an educated audience. You guys all know that the gerrymandering is drawing traditionally of congressional districts or state legislative districts to maximize partisan political advantage. You can't gerrymander the Senate because senators are elected statewide. But it's kind of fascinating to see how much people are irked about this these days, and how much people want to see, by golly, if there are lots more people voting in California than Wyoming, that's just not fair. And then I went back and I checked, and look at all kinds of different censuses. The differences between, say, New York State, which was the most populous state in the union for a lot of years, and each new territory was generally a much bigger proportion than the difference between Wyoming and California now. By the way, if we really hate all of these small states and that have very few people in it, and the idea that this is somehow undemocratic or unrepresentative, you realize Vermont's got to get rid of Sanders and Leahy, right? Right, Greg? They'd have to get rid of Rhode Island and its 2 senators, Delaware and its 2. There are a whole bunch of little tiny states that happen to have, with low population, that just happen to have 2 Democratic senators. I don't really, usually it's for some reason Wyoming is always the one that gets picked on for being unrepresentative. But I think what's even more important about this is, we think back to Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims, and kind of the formation of the United States. There's a reason we're called the United States and not the United Nation. The states are supposed to be important. The states are supposed to matter. We're supposed to be able to live differently in different parts of the country under different laws, as long as everybody respects the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And it's kind of fascinating to see how many people really get irked by this. And I believe kind of would like to get rid of the states entirely. They really would like to see as much decision-making as possible concentrated in Washington, and to make the states pretty much uniform from coast to coast, and to really not have that much significant variation, which I think is not in the keeping of the thinking of the founders. I think also just a pretty much a formula for social disharmony and tension and perhaps even disunion, because people in Wyoming or people in Texas don't want to live the same way that people do in Massachusetts or in Oregon. We're very much, as time goes by, it becomes very clear. We have, urban areas that are very democratic, generally very liberal, very progressive, open, people celebrating how great socialism is, except for the rich people who live in those areas who don't really want to do it, but who like, making the noises like that. And then you have the big rural areas in the country that are much more libertarian, you could say, much smaller government, just kind of, generally be left alone. And then you have people in the suburbs who kind of have a little bit of both. And ideally, with federalism, the idea of allowing people to live the way they want to live and let the states make the decisions themselves, you know what? Let them sort it out. Everybody gets much more likely to get what they want. And if things get really bad, they can always vote with their feet somewhere else. I have a much easier time getting a hold of my mayor or my local city councilman or my town councilman than I do of getting an audience with the president of the United States. The government that is closest to you is probably going to be most responsive to your needs and to your problems. And that's why you want to concentrate as much decision-making down at that local level as you possibly can. Are there exceptions? Sure, of course. Of course, we need an FBI. Of course, we need various federal law enforcement and the Environmental Protection Agency and things like that. Anyway, so I'm just glad the country is formed the way it is. I'm kind of disheartening to hear people complaining about it. And not understanding that there's a reason of why the North is the way the North is and the South is the way the South is. But we'll see how things shake out. Hopefully I don't see any effort to redraw the state lines anytime soon. And so this is basically, it's now a group of progressives basically yelling at the weather.
Excellent choice. I like that. I like that very much. And for my final thing that I'm thankful for, the GOP is going to lose the House come January. We already know that. And it took a lot of flack from the right in some circumstances for not doing more with Republicans controlling all the levers of power, House, Senate, and the presidency. Not getting the job done on Obamacare repeal, for example, was a big deal. And the House actually passed a bill. The Senate couldn't get it done. But there's one thing you like the legislature to do, and that's give you more rights instead of taking them away from you with their big government power grabs. And one of the pieces of legislation that President Trump highlighted in his State of the Union address and got done by lopsided margins is known as right to try. Basically, it gives people the option to try experimental treatments if they're facing difficult health situations. They don't have to necessarily wait for FDA approval. It's up to them. If they feel like this is the best option to try and treat whatever ailment they have, and the clock might be ticking on their opportunity to actually address it and have some potential success, right to try gives them the freedom to do that in a lot of circumstances instead of waiting for the government to give the green light. So more freedom to the people, hopefully more lives saved and healthier, more robust lives. Good job, Congress, and good job, President Trump.
Those are three really good choices there, Greg. I always think, I'm pleased with mine. I'm really, a lot of good points in what I'm saying, a lot of laughs. Then I hear yours, and I think, dang it, I should have thought of that one.
There's a lot of good, even in a crazy upside down year like this. There's so much to be thankful for. And as we said at the beginning, it's just on the political side that we're really focusing on this podcast. And as Jim so well said at the beginning, there's so many more important things than just politics to be thankful for. This time of year, God has blessed this country very, very richly in so many ways. So be thankful that you live here. Be thankful for your loved ones. Cherish them this holiday season. Don't waste the time arguing about politics, and enjoy the time together. Hopefully the Bears win. And just enjoy your Thanksgiving. We do really have a great deal to be thankful for. And Jim, as I like to say every year, very thankful to you and the opportunity to do this podcast and for our great listeners and sponsors as well.
Thanks to you again, Greg. And boy, I don't know, but I'm already looking forward to my Black Friday shopping.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone. And join us again on Friday for the Black Friday special of the Three Martini Lunch.